so excited. We're going to go over some questions that we would have. Would the length of time a horse raced have an impact on his retraining?
I mean, from some regards, horses that have raced for longer are going to be used to a very specific routine. So they're going to be used to kind of a specific jogging routine, a training routine. They're going to be used to wearing certain equipment in order to race and do their job. And so a lot of the times, kind of the longer they race, we may see more compensatory body changes because they do, you know, they race in counterclockwise direction. They do jog in clockwise direction, but you know, from racing for a number of years, for example, my horse, you know, he raced for 12 years going to the left. So he had a lot of challenges because I had to undo that many years of going in one direction at top speed. Whereas if you have, say, a young horse that didn't even make it to the racetrack, that maybe just wasn't fast enough or wasn't gaited well enough or something like that, that didn't make it to the racetrack, those horses maybe don't have some of those compensatory changes because they weren't going fast enough to have some of those secondary injuries. But then kind of the trade-off is that sort of a younger horse that hasn't made it to the races or maybe only raced a few times, its exposure is going to be a lot less. So it's not going to be used, yes, they still see a lot and they have a lot done to them at a young age, and so they're pretty amazing even at a young age. But, you know, that 12-year-old Standardbred is going to be bomb-proof. It is going to have been there, done that, seen everything, and nothing. It's going to be pretty unflappable. The younger Standardbreds, they are exposed to a lot of things and definitely catch on and adapt to changes a little bit easier, but we can, you know, remembering they're still a 2-year-old or 3-year-old or 4-year-old, you know, they're still a young horse, so mentally their brain is going to be a little bit more immature, so they still might need a little bit more patience than maybe an old horse, but vice versa, that old horse might need a little bit of patience from a body perspective as it's relearning a whole new job, where its body has done the same thing for a really long time. One of the biggest myths that comes up with regards to Standardbreds is that, that they can't canter. They can definitely canter. There's a lot of horses that you'll hear of that kind of train on the gallop or train on the canter to try and move and use their muscles in a different way, open up their lungs a different way, and just from a boredom perspective, that way they're doing something different. However, in an older horse, those horses have spent, you know, again, 8 to 12 years being basically taught, we want you to only trot or pace and not canter, because in a race, if a horse changes gait or what's called makes a break, and so it switches and it goes from a pace into a canter, then that horse is either placed back in the race, so it's moved down, even if it won the race. If it went across the race, the finish line, not in the pace, but it went across the finish line in the canter, that horse didn't officially win the race in the pace, so then it'll get set back. And you can potentially, you know, cause an accident or interfere with other horses if your horse makes a break. So those horses have spent a long period of time being told, you are not allowed to do anything but pace or trot. So not only do we have the physical compensations of the pace takes very certain muscles, the trot takes very certain muscles compared to a canter. A canter is a whole different way of balancing. Trying to balance when you literally spent your life always balancing on the same 2 legs, to all of a sudden you need to sit down, use your haunches, balance on one leg, and be able to come forwards and bend, you know, through your rib cage, through your neck. It's a very different way of moving. And mentally, they have been told, no, you're not allowed to do that. You know, discouraged from going into a canter. So, I retrained a 12-year-old how to do this. He would canter. I mean, you turn him out in the field and you'd watch him kind of cantery pace thing. So a lot of times you'll find what they do is they canter with their front end, but they might stay pacing with their back end. And that's because it is a whole new grouping of muscles. So the pace is a lot of kind of lower back thoracolumbar junction rotation through your pelvis. to pace, right? Whereas your canter, they have to sit down, so they have to really rock through their pelvis and their SI and rock through it to be able to sit, load through their glutes, load through their quads, sit, and then spring into the canter. So you are using a whole different muscle grouping that doesn't exist. So don't expect your horse is going to be able to all of a sudden go on a lunge line and be able to canter the first day you get them. What I really had to work at, and so kind of from a retraining perspective, you really have to look at using their body differently. So working on symmetry of their muscles, working on rebuilding a lot of their hindquarter muscles that, again, they're used to the sway or the swing. And so they use a very different subgrouping of muscles to do that, as opposed to trotting and canter work where we have to get them to sit. And so I worked a lot on symmetry and trying to get him to be flexible, to bend, worked on his hindquarter work, so a lot of kind of pull work, equiband systems, Pessoa systems, teaching them, because a lot of them they just don't know how to rock through their pelvis, because that is not how you pace. You don't rock through your pelvis to pace. So a lot of them have no idea. I mean, I did a lot of chiropractic and acupuncture work on my guys, so bringing in, you know, whether it's body work, chiro, acupuncture, teaching them how to reuse a lot of those muscles and reuse their SI can be very helpful. And then different training methods, so walking up and down hills, if you can find one here in Alberta, but walking up and down hills, pole work, even just walking over poles, starting simple, you know, they'll go over a pole, but I find their body awareness is really poor, what we call proprioception. And so, I mean, especially with a 12-year-old gelding that's never walked over a pole before, he would do it, but bang, 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 and so it took him a while to learn to be careful, because he wasn't afraid of the poles. He didn't spook when he hit all the poles. He just walked over them because I asked him to walk over them. But he had no concept that, no, you're actually supposed to lift your legs over the poles. So that in itself was a whole, he just thought, oh yeah, it's another something on the ground, I just have to get over it. Yeah. So reteaching him to actually lift up his legs and step over them. So always start with a smaller number of poles, you know, ground poles, working up to raised poles, doing a lot of things like carrot stretches to work on flexing and bending through the neck. Things like leg yields can be really good, working on bending through the rib cage. And then I found in the beginning, Greek had a harder time trying to canter on a circle. And a lot of that was because they don't go in tight little circles. They're not used to lunging. They're not used to having all those fine motor muscles to go in a small little circle. So cantering on a circle was not going to happen. He would pace his way through it and be like, I'm more balanced, because as soon as he became off balance, he swapped to the pace. So I had a much easier time for me, again, he was an older guy, retraining him to canter outside on a straight line. So I used arena work and you know, teaching him how to lunge and pole work and everything to really work on his muscles. But for him mentally, he'd see the corner of the arena coming, and you could see him prepare and go, I know I'm going to be off balance. And so he'd swap to the pace to come around the corner, because he felt more comfortable doing that. Whereas if I was in a straight line outside, once he knew what I was, we would start by just kind of, I used a lot of voice commands on him, because that worked really well on the lunge line. And then once we get outside, kind of really encouraging that forward motion. And it would start out where he'd pick up the canter with the front end and pace in the back end. And then the stronger he got, the stronger he caught. Man, he had a gallop on him. Oh, it was awesome. What I did find is that in the early stages, once we go straight line in a canter, as he was tired, or if he was feeling weak, or as we downward transition was really hard, he would often swap to the pace, then down to the trot. And the stronger he got, we could go from a canter to a trot, but it took a while to rebuild those muscles, again, differently. You know, I never focused on him because it's not like I was doing Grand Prix dressage. I wasn't focusing so much on lead changes on him because we just had a ball galloping around. He'd swap a little bit, and so he always had a bit of an easier time on the left than he did on the right. He'd kind of always pick one up, and if he felt a little unbalanced, initially he'd swap to the pace, but then what I found is he'd just swap leads to the canter. So that was really awesome, is that he was getting stronger to be able to find different ways to balance himself. But come on, you gotta brush at the pace every once in a while. Oh, that was fun. So, you know, when you're learning, it is really amazing for them to, once they kind of get the canter, but it's also a lot of fun to stay on your 2 points at the pace and just go brush and go. Yeah, good times. Yeah. So yes, I never discouraged that, and maybe I should have, and maybe I would have gotten the canter a little faster, but it's not that they can't canter, it's part of it's mental, but a large part of it is just making sure the muscle memory is there. So I think in a young horse, it will come a lot faster for a younger horse, that you can rebuild their muscles a little faster versus an older horse.
Old campaigner.
Yeah, exactly. An old campaigner. This is how I've gone for a long time. It's going to take a lot more to change how they rotate the pelvis and the SI under, as opposed to rotation. Yeah.
I found with my old guys, because I live in more rolling hills, that I found summer fall field with a little bit of a hill.
Yes.
So the deeper footing.
Yes.
And you could just push them up the hill,
and then they go right into the canter. Yeah.
It wasn't a gallop, they could actually canter.
Yes.
But yeah, whatever you got in
your
neighborhood,
take advantage. Yeah, I mean, there are
definitely
different devices, training tools you can use. Like I said, like the Acclimating and the Pessoa. Greek loved the Pessoa. I swear you would just see his whole brain click on and be like, it's go time. And he thought he was working again. He loved the Pessoa. And it was, for him, was an amazing way, because so Standardbreds wear head checks. So they wear, it's a safety equipment that keeps their head up so that they can't put their head down when they're racing and potentially have the hobble hangers drop below their knees and cause them to crash to the ground. So it keeps their head up and attached to their harness. So they are a little bit more on kind of the inverted side because of how their head is up. Well, in more of our kind of English disciplines and Western disciplines, we want their head a little bit lower, right? And so I found for me that so instead of me feeling like I had to fight with him, I really liked the Pessoa system. I had it super long, I had it set to the low setting, and it was amazing how quickly he started to reach for that contact, to stretch over his back, and it encouraged some hind quarter use. But I swear, because it had lines on it, he still felt like he was doing something and working. But you could see his whole personality change, and his whole trot would change when he was in a Pessoa. And so that, for me, was a great retraining tool when I know I wasn't skilled enough. Like, let's be frank, I'm not a horse trainer. I was not skilled enough to lift his core and kind of get him to round for more than 2 steps at a time. So I used a training aid to help with that fitness, because, you know, I'm just like most of you guys, I'm kind of a backyard rider, right? I'm not a Grand Prix jumper, I'm not a CFR barrel racer, so I kind of knew my limitations from time and my personal fitness, but I also knew that this is what my horse needed to get fit enough to be stronger in doing the things that I was asking him to do. So, you know, I didn't want to be a kind of a weekend warrior and just sort of show up and expect I could pull him out of the stall and we could go gallop across the field. So I had to put in some groundwork to get there.
If you're considering getting a Standardbred, you heard of one and you're thinking about it, would you recommend a pre-purchase exam?
So as a veterinarian, I always recommend a pre-purchase exam, whether you're getting a horse free from your neighbors or whether you're, you know, spending $100,000 on a horse. I always recommend a pre-purchase exam because it's the free horses that often cost you a little bit more money in the end. So the biggest thing we look for in a pre-purchase exam is we kind of combine 2 things. We're doing a full physical exam. So we're having to listen to this horse's heart, and its lungs, and we're looking at its eyes, we're looking at its teeth and its mouth, we're having a feel of all of its legs. We're looking for any obvious abnormalities that may impact its ability to do its job in the future. We'll also typically do a lameness exam with some flexions, so where we stress a joint. So for example, we'll pick up a leg and we'll flex it at the fetlock, which flexes kind of the fetlock and the pastern and the coffin joint all at the same time. We'll hold it in place for a certain period of time, then we jog that horse off. So if I have, again, kind of a 12-year-old horse that just came off the track, I'm not going to be surprised if it flexes a little bit positive on a couple legs. But that is no different than my, you know, Spruce Meadows top winning class jumper in the international ring is going to flex a little positive in a couple places. Horses that are in intensive work and intensive training, give them the benefit of the doubt. They're allowed to flex a little bit positive. As long as that horse doesn't have any soreness to palpate the tendons, doesn't have any effusion in a joint, you know, we kind of have to take all those pieces together. If I cripple a horse on a flexion, then maybe I want to have a better idea on what's going on in that joint or in that tendon and do some imaging, so take some x-rays, etc. But you, again, have to kind of put it all in perspective of what the horse's potential job is going to be. Did it just race on the weekend, or, you know, has it been turned out in a field for 2 months? If I have a horse come in that's been turned out for a bit of time, I expect that horse is going to be a little bit sounder, flex a little bit better than maybe a horse that literally just raced yesterday and is going to have a few aches and pains. So kind of pre-purchases we have to put together with what your goals of the horse are. If you want an amazing family pet that you just kind of pack the kids around, well, then we're going to be able to accept a few little things, as opposed to if your goal is to do FEI competitive trail, then okay, maybe there's a few other things we don't accept. But as I kind of has said previously, Standardbreds are tough. I mean, my horse's front ankle had definite arthritic change in it. It was missing little pieces of its sesamoid where he had fractured them and taken them out. He had some, you know, an old injury to his suspensory ligament. He had a few things, but for what my goals were, he was what we call serviceably sound. He was sound, flexed a little positive in 1 or 2 little spots. Did he need a bit of maintenance? Yeah, he did, but that was okay. And it was no different than if I had gone and bought, you know, a 12-year-old quarter horse that was just as broke, that probably has a little bit of arthritis in his hocks, for example, right? So you have to look at what your goals are and what you're willing to do as a maintenance and your trade-off. I mean, on a Standardbred, you're getting something that is dead ground broke. I mean, ground manners on these guys are bar none. They know how to tie for hours. They stand. They pick up their feet. They are used to flags. They're used to tractors. You know, a Greek had been off the track for a couple weeks, and I put a saddle on his back, and we went to Yahatinda for a couple hours. I mean, and that was his first time with a saddle and a rider, and he said, "Okay, this is what we're doing today." Yeah. So you can't trade a brain. And that's what I think the Standardbreds are known for, is just having such a good brain. From the physical side of things, yeah, do we want to identify and make sure the heart doesn't have any murmurs or arrhythmias, that maybe that's why they were retired from racing. We want to make sure that, I mean, knock on wood, eye injuries in Standardbreds are very rare, but make sure that their eyes look good, make sure their lungs sound okay, make sure we don't have any obvious defects that may impact that horse's ability in the future. What is pretty amazing about our Standardbred trainers is that they want the very best thing for their horses. So just ask questions from where they're coming from. So the trainers will be able to tell you exactly how much feed it gets, how many miles it's jogging a day, what equipment it wears when it races, how it feels after a race, if it is receiving, you know, does it have a history of tying up? Does it have a history of any breathing problems? You know, what kind of medications it has been used, when it last had me go over it or saw a veterinarian. They're very open. They want to make sure that these guys go to a good home and get treated appropriately afterwards and kind of show off the breed to the best of their ability. So just ask. They're not going to hide anything. They are so open about everything. And so a lot of the times you can get a pretty amazing history about what this horse's life has been like up till its time with you, so that you can make better decisions on if it's going to be a good fit for your family and good fit for what it is that you're wanting to use it for. So, you know, ask questions, or if you're getting your Standardbred through, you know, a rehoming group, a lot of them will have as many answers from the trainer as they're able to get. In a lot of cases, vet records are released. Again, a lot of my trainers are awesome, and they're like, yeah, sure, they'll open up the vet records to whatever kind of rehoming agency that they're using. In this case, Performance Standardbreds. They'll be like, hey, yeah, you know, you can call Dr. Cook and she can tell you whatever you want to know. So you'll get that whole history. And then depending how much time it's been spent with rehoming group, they will know other details about that horse based on their experience with that horse in a very different setting than being at the racetrack. But generally, it's pretty stable across the board that the horse you're meeting is the horse you're getting, and they're pretty chill about the whole thing. But yeah, I think a pre-purchase is a good idea. And like I said, I would say that whether you're getting a free horse from your neighbor or you're breaking the bank on the horse, because unfortunately I've seen horses after they've been purchased, and again, whether that was a free horse or a cheap horse on Kijiji, that turns out they have major problems that would have been identified on a pre-purchase exam, and now that horse is no longer suitable for what it was that they got the horse for in the first place. Exactly. Yeah, and now you've got the expense of what do you do with the horse that's in front of you, and it needs diagnostics, it might need treatment, it might need care, or it might need to be retired, and now it needs a pasture life, and now you still have to go and buy another horse to do the things you want. So I think a pre-purchase exam is a good idea. I know a lot of people that have rehomed their Standardbreds with no pre-purchase exam, that again, maybe they're young horses that didn't make the races, raced a few times, just weren't fast enough. I mean, the chances of those horses having issues is a lot lower, but and again, the trainers are usually pretty open, so I think it's whatever your comfort level is for what you're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. Do horses require stabling when they come off the track, or can they be turned out on pasture 24/7 right away?
So most Standardbreds live in a barn, so they live in a stall, they are taken out and jogged, and then are often put back in the stall. Depending on whether they are stabled at the racetrack or at the farm, they may have some access to turnout. A lot of the trainers at the racetrack have small little round pens set up, so these horses do get some sort of a turnout. If they're stabled at the farm, again, a lot of them are used to some sort of a turnout. And asking questions with your trainer, have these horses been turned out? So for example, a lot of horses get shut down in the winter time. They may have raced through the stake races for the summer and then they get turned out for the winter. Well, a lot of them will go and board them at a farm where they'll turn out 2 or 3 of them together in a pasture for the winter. So a lot of these horses are used to some degree of turnout. Whether or not they've been with another horse before is maybe kind of the big question mark. But I think that they can transition to being outside if that's the kind of what you have available to you. It's not that they've never been out on turnout before. The biggest difference you may find is that there may be less of them that have stayed overnight outside, for example. Looking at their hair coat. So because these guys often they live inside in a stall, they get bathed a lot more frequently. Often their hair coats for the winter in Alberta is not suitable for living out without added protection. So you almost have to treat them sort of like a clipped horse or an indoor horse, that you need to be prepared that in the winter time, those horses are gonna need extra blanketing because they're not gonna be used to it. They just are used to a very specific routine, so you can't kind of just take a horse that's had a job and go and turn it in the field and not look at it for a month, right? That they're used to handling every day. They are used to being brought inside, having their feet picked and groomed, and go out and do something. So I think kind of the biggest transition is that mental stimulation, where they are used to very intense mental stimulation every day. And yeah, they need maybe a little bit of kind of downtime to say, okay, don't worry, we're not racing. You can just relax. But I think they're job horses. They really like to have a job, and so they look for that job. And if you don't give them one, they're going to go and find themselves a job. And so, yeah, exactly. And then it's called trouble. So I think one thing in that transition, whether they're in a stall, whether they're having turnout, whether they're living out, is their need for contact and their need for interaction. So still being prepared that in that transition time, those horses are going to want to come inside, or going to at least be, caught, handled, brushed, feet picked. Maybe whether you're working them in an arena, maybe you're not working them in an arena, maybe they're just outside in your backyard, but then doing some hand walking with them, some leading with them. There are basic kind of ground things that you can even do during some sort of downtime and transition time into a new life that these horses are going to be looking for from you. And so simple things that, again, even practicing simple stuff like putting a saddle on their back doesn't necessarily mean you need to get on them. They're used to every piece of equipment on the back, but a saddle is a little bit different. A saddle is a little bit new, but they're used to interaction every day. And so I think that's the biggest thing I find that they look for, is they look for that routine of interaction. Most Standardbreds do really well with other horses. I mean, knock on wood, they kind of been, most of the time, they're in close quarters, right? Where they're often close or touching, or they're next door to each other. So they are quite social because they're used to having that interaction. But again, I think asking your trainer if they have been turned out with other horses or not, because it's more likely they've been turned out individually. So your biggest transition might be that they start out by themselves and then slowly introducing them, not necessarily to a herd of 20 horses, but sort of finding an equal for them and transitioning them into a group herd. They do amazing once they're in a group herd, but sometimes they just don't know how. And they're kind of the socially awkward creatures sometimes, where they've sort of done their own thing and been very independent for so long and very reliant on people that they're more people horses than they are horses, right? And so they sometimes are, they need a little bit of an adjustment time. It's kind of a quirky thing where Standardbreds have very unique personalities and a lot of times have very different expressions. So the head whip is one of them. It is a Standardbred thing, and when they're, mad, frustrated, being impatient, whatever, they'll whip their heads. And so literally I can pick the Standardbred out of the backfield because they'll do, so some of these quirky behaviors are quite interesting because you can almost see the other horses in the herd kind of look at him like he's the geeky kid in the group. I don't think they get beat up on, but sometimes they can be a little bit of an outcast for a while until they've adjusted. So I would say that's something to be aware of, is trying to find a buddy for your Standardbred. Because sometimes, because they're a little different, they take a little longer to integrate into the herd. They're not the social butterfly. They're sort of the awkward teenager. They'll find they'll play. They have a lot of oral kind of fixation things. They play with their tongue a lot. They might sort of flap their lips because they're used to being tied. So they're used to being tied with their equipment on, getting ready to race. So a lot of them kind of play with the bit and they get used to that. So they'll roll their tongue or they'll flap their lips, or and so they'll stand tied for hours, but they'll have little funny behaviors that getting used to your horse's specific behavior, because we want to make sure you're recognizing what situations that they happen in. Is it a stress behavior? Is it a boredom behavior? And not confusing it with, a colic behavior. For example, that they're flapping their lips. My old man, he would sit there and I'd call it his worried lip, because he'd sit there and he would just flap his lower lip. If something new was happening, he'd be like, okay, I'll do what you ask, but I'm a little bit worried about it, and he'd flap his lower lip. So kind of looking for those quirky behaviors. But I definitely think that they can transition to that kind of setting with a few modifications, recognizing these horses have previously been indoor horses, so might need a little TLC, especially in the cold weather. From a diet perspective, these horses are used to being fed 3 to 4 times a day. Typically, they either are getting fed hay or hay cubes. They're typically on a different diet than, say, our thoroughbreds. So Standardbreds race every week. Typically, they're on a lot more of a high-fat diet, a lot less sweet feeds, a lot less of our high-sugar diets that what you would see in thoroughbreds. So in thoroughbreds, because they're racing a lot less often they are getting a lot of things like sweet feeds, sugary feeds, higher, what we call higher carbohydrate or higher NSC type feeds, because they want them a little bit hotter and a little bit more revved up to leave it all out there on the track in one go. Whereas because our Standardbreds are racing every week, we need almost what we call slow burn energy. So a lot of them are on different feeds that you can just pick up at the local tech store. So, they might be on Podium, which is a master feed. They might be on Equicow. They might be on something like, step 4, step 8. So a lot of our more basic complete or high fat, high fiber feeds, where we're maintaining weight, we're maintaining that slow burn energy. I kind of equate the difference is Standardbreds are fed a plate of spaghetti before every hockey game, whereas our Thoroughbreds are given a couple chocolate bars before their hockey game, right? So the Standardbreds are going to be able to go all 3 periods, whereas maybe the Thoroughbreds will be able to go 1 shot on 1 shift as hard as they can, and then that's it. Then they're done. So from a diet perspective, I find that they handle it a lot easier. What you will find again is these horses are used to getting fed some type of an added kind of a grain supplement, often an added fat supplement. You know, they might be getting a joint supplement. They're getting a lot of added things that they're also used to receiving 2 to 3 times a day. So especially if your horse is stable inside, you may notice he reminds you that it's feed time. So typically they might get fed early in the morning. They may get fed again around kind of 12, 1 o'clock when they're done jogging for the morning. And then again at sort of what we call feed time or night time. And so they may start looking for that added feed. And again, they're typically used to getting maybe a little bit less hay than being just turned out on a round bed. So they might be looking for that added supplementation from the grain, more so than realizing this is sort of their sole source of nutrition. So I think a little bit of a transition again, where you have kind of a racing greyhound in front of you, right? That is used to a higher calorie diet. Yes, the workload is going to decrease, but those horses' metabolism are still really ramped up. So in that early stage, providing an added calorie source, then that can obviously be changed as needed depending on what the horse's intended workload is going to be. But they're going to kind of look for it, and that metabolism is still really high. Just because you took him off the track doesn't mean his metabolism immediately says, oh, you're retired now, or oh, don't worry, you don't need to go so fast anymore. You may, if you don't supplement a little bit extra, maybe they're not intaking as much hay as you would expect from, kind of, our porky little quarter horses that go out and blow up and they're this big. They may not intake as much hay because they're looking for and relying on supplemental feeds for a little bit added calories. You may notice a bit of weight loss. So obviously we're trying to prevent that. And so making sure to try and manage that and be prepared, they're going to need some type of a supplemental, either complete feed or high fat, high fiber type feed as we transition. Then we adjust their diet depending on what their caloric output is going to be or what their actual job is going to be as their metabolism settles. So just because I'm saying metabolism settles, I don't necessarily mean those horses are hot coming off the track. I mean, they're generally pretty laid back coming off the track compared to, again, some of our Thoroughbreds are a little bit more, and that's a diet difference and a personality difference and sort of a training regime perspective, but their metabolism is still going to be higher because they're a fit horse, not necessarily just because they're kind of a hot horse. But they do look for work. They anticipate that, okay, when am I going back to the track? When are we going back to the races? So they might look for the horse trailer initially, thinking, okay, my week on turnout's good. Now we go back now, right? And so they might, their energy levels are still going to be high because again, you have a fit horse. They could bring in home a border collie, a working border collie that you just took off the farm, and they're still used to having a job. They can transition to be pet horses. They just need to be given different things to focus on and different jobs and their metabolisms to settle down a little bit. But I think the Standardbreds do it very, very easily. So, yeah.
Going back to putting different breeds together, I had 2 or 3 Standardbreds in the same field as 3 quarter horses. And there was a gate out to the winter pasture, which is our hay field. There's lots of snow, but they get to paw and get to the hay. The quarter horses would all go out there, and all day, I might not even see them for the whole day. The Standardbreds would not go. They were like, I don't do that.
Yeah,
you bring the hay to me. That's how it works here. So they really didn't
I've seen it a couple times where, like, you know, you kind of have the sole standardbred in a herd of like warm bloods, for example, and initially they might kind of shun it, where they'll be like, he just kind of, it's always on the outside, and it's almost like they sort of know that this one is a little different. There's something that's a little different here. You know, they do become a part of the herd, but it's that initial, there's something a little bit different about them. Like I said, they're kind of the socially awkward kid in the class, and that's but they aren't, I wouldn't say they're troublemakers, or they're not mean horses in a herd. They just don't really know how to interact as well. Right off the hop, exactly.
How soon could they begin a new training program, and do you have any recommendations or concerns when preparing them for transitioning to a new career?
So I think I've kind of touched on a little bit of that, but I mean, these guys can head into a new career, I mean, almost immediately, recognizing that no matter what you're going to be asking them to do, even if you're going to be asking them to do trail work, it is a different career. It is a whole different group of muscles that they are going to be used to than what they're used to using. It is going to be a whole different type of work than what they're going to be used to, and that just comes down to training and patience. You know, just where they're going to be bomb-proof to 99% of the things you're going to throw at them, but it doesn't necessarily mean they know what leg means. They don't necessarily know what, you know, oh, you're supposed to go over the bridge? Oh, okay. I mean, they're not scared of the bridge, but they just have no idea what you're asking for, or going through water. I mean, Greek would literally walk up to the edge of the water, and he'd stand there, and he wasn't afraid of it, but he would just be like, why? Why are we going through this? Exactly. And then he would touch, someone would just come up, touch his lungs, and he'd walk right in, and we'd be up to our belly, and he didn't care. But he would go, why are we doing this? So a little bit of sort of some of that mental transition as well into, okay, I'll do all the things that you ask. You just have to tell me that this is what you want. So I think trying to, sort of like we touched on, you can start on their work as soon as they come home. I think even starting with the basics is as they're adjusting, getting them out, hand walking them, starting to move them over some poles, you know, doing different exercises like walking them up and down hills, working on squat muscles, right? Working on strengthening your glutes, working on strengthening your quads, doing different exercises to work on some flexibility, so carrot stretches to stretch through their neck, some belly lifts to work on their core and really support their back. So all of a sudden, starting to say, hey, muscles that you haven't used in a while, let's start to retrain you. And those are simple things you can do when grooming even. So working on kind of bonding with your horse, again, getting them used to having a saddle on the back. 99% of them don't care. You can practice getting on and off their back. Teaching them leg can be a little bit different because depending on how long. You know, some of the methods I tried were a tiny little spur. I also tried 2 whips. So I had 2 whips in my hand. So as I put leg on, I would kind of give him a tap. That worked really well. Again, I taught voice commands to Greek, and that was awesome because it really helped as he was learning what my leg meant. So voice commands when I was either line driving him or teaching the lunge. These guys don't know how to lunge, I'll tell you that. So you can't just put them on a lunge line and then chase them away and expect they're going to know to go in a circle around you. They're going to have no idea what you ask. So working on doing some lunging work, teaching them how to lunge, flexibility. So you can put every piece of equipment on them you possibly want, but ask them to trot in a circle is going to be a whole nother ballgame. So you're going to find little funny things like that. You're going to be like, you could do that all day long, but you can't do that. So
right now,
exactly, right. And so some of the things are really working on kind of flexibility and muscle development. So I definitely think those are things you can start right away. Again, you have a fit horse in front of you, but his fitness is meant for a different job, most likely, than what you are going to be asking him to do. So, you know, if you are looking at turning him into a combined driving horse, well, he just came out there. There's no reason you can't be starting to do those things, but it doesn't mean you can all of a sudden be asking him to go around obstacles, because he has no idea what you're asking for. Remember, he has got
weight.
Exactly.
They don't
Yeah.
pull weight.
They pull very, very light, typically titanium or aluminum sulkies with light drivers in them. So they are used to going really fast and they're used to going long miles, but they aren't used to pulling a heavier carriage, for example. They aren't used to, again, that flexibility. They're used to going in an oval. So all of a sudden, that flexibility you're asking for to go around obstacles. So even though they know how to drive, they don't necessarily know how to turn on a 90-degree angle, right, like that. So having to really work on some flexibility things, again, kind of training what the obstacles actually are. And then when it comes to like the dressage phase of the combined driving, again, that's a whole different ballgame for them, because they're used to wearing a shorter head check to keep their head up, and then pacing and striding out like this. A lot of them will do trot work, so as part of their kind of trotting miles and fitness, many of them will not have a head check on, so they are used to going free, but some of them, it's even just ingrained into them mentally and habit of, you know, something new is happening, they kind of immediately giraffe.
Right.
What are we doing? What are we looking for? Are we racing today? And so they have a tendency to carry themselves a little bit more sort of sternum forwards and head up, especially when something new is happening. And so kind of retraining that relaxation, really trying to get them to flex and bend and round down. But that's not going to happen overnight. Most of them don't know how to flex and bend through their neck. It doesn't mean they can't, but they're used to just going straight, so they don't.
Yeah.
Same with moving the ribcage. You don't have to move your ribcage side to side to race around a track, so they don't know how to necessarily kind of flex and bend, and I find they're often one-sided. So, you know, even sitting on Greek and looking down, you would see the neck and shoulder muscles on his left side were beef, and then there was nothing on the right side. You know, so because he got really used to that strong arm of pulling himself around with that left side, even though technically it's a symmetrical gait, they're still going in one direction, so they're still a little bit one-sided. So trying to identify what side of your horse is a little stronger, a little weaker, so you can work on the weaker side a little bit more. But yeah, I think it can definitely get started into work right away, recognizing it's a very different kind of work, and so you're not going to be all of a sudden jumping on their back and asking them to go to a dressage test right away. So, but you can start on the rehab portion of things in retraining their muscles and their flexibility, and rebuilding muscles that they don't currently have. They're just really fit.